This is Evelyn Stan reporting from the village of Holcomb, which stands on the high wheat plains of western Kansas, a lonesome area that other Kansans call out there. Some 70 miles east of the Colorado border, the countryside, with its hard blue skies and desert clear air, has an atmosphere that is rather more far west than Middle West. The land is flat and the views are awesomely extensive. Horses, herds of cattle, a white cluster of grain elevators rising as gracefully as the Greek temples are visible long before a traveler reaches them. Holcomb, too, can be seen from great distances. Not that there is much to see, simply an aimless congregation of buildings. Mid-morning of November 16th of 1959, the four bodies of Herb Clutter, Bonnie Clutter, Nancy Clutter, and Kenyon Clutter were discovered in their homes by a close friend. So far, no suspects have been identified, and the whole town is shocked to its core. Fortunately, local authorities are on the case.
Later.
After a recent anonymous tip, lead investigators are now searching for one Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. These two men are previous criminals. Here are their mugshots. If you see these men, please call the number below.
This program is brought to you in part by...
Hi, I'm Ira Herschel, and I'm here to bring you the killer combo of irony and hypocrisy. I first bought this product when I was reading In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. There are two types of murders in this book, one legal and one illegal, one moral and one immoral. But what's the difference? Newsflash, there isn't one. During the hanging of the two criminals, Richard and Harry, the minds of justice are cracking jokes, their lack of respect for human life appalling, making them just as bad as the very criminals they punish. Boom. This is me before I bought the product. But after I bought the product, everything was so clear. And even better, I can apply it to all the books I read.
Smith, and today I'm going to teach you the perfect recipe for sympathy. For this specific recipe, we are going to be recreating Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. How does Capote evoke sympathy for a murderer? Our main ingredient is juxtaposition. First, we have side-by-side comparisons of Richard and Perry. Descriptions of Richard as selfish and abrasive are followed by descriptions of Perry's meek and submissive nature, highlighting his humanity. While poor and on the run, Perry forces Richard to accept two hitchhikers, an old man and a young boy, even though he knows he will receive nothing in return. His violence is also strangely accompanied by empathy and consideration towards his victims. He drags over a mattress box for Mr. Clutter because he thinks it's wrong to ask him to lie on the cold, hard ground. He places a pillow under Kenyon's head because he wants him to stop coughing. He prevents Richard from raping Nancy and pulls the covers up to her shoulders so she is no longer exposed. He comforts Mrs. Clutter when she is consumed by panic and desperation. In fact, Mrs. Clutter says that he seems like a decent young man and prefers him over Richard. Following his arrest, Perry continued to leave unexpected impressions on characters such as lead investigator Alvin Dewey, who said he found it possible to look at the man beside him without anger, with rather a measure of sympathy, for Perry Smith's life had been no bed of roses. Then throw in a couple of toppings: a tragic motorcycle accident that resulted in physical disfiguration and the label of a cripple.
fatal family history. A mother, an alcoholic mother, mind you, who choked on her own vomit. A sister who jumped out of a building and died. A brother who killed himself after discovering he led his own wife to suicide. Another sister who feared him. And a father who would never understand him. Mix it all together and throw it in the oven. And there you have it, folks. Sympathy.
This program is brought to you in part by
Ethos.
Hi, I'm Erin, and I'm here to talk to you about the power of ethos. In Cold Blood, Truman Capote intentionally includes the unspoken testimony of a licensed psychologist and the article Murder Without Apparent Motive, which was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, in order to prove his credibility. Readers are influenced to acknowledge that they are being told the truth and to accept his perspective on psychological concepts. Hello, I'm Kashmir Erickson, and I'm here today to show you the wonders of cause and effect. Let's take a look at our crime board, shall we?
He says he tried to stop you, Perry, but says he couldn't. Says he was scared you'd shoot him too. Yes, sir, Perry, it's all your fault. Hickok himself, he says he wouldn't harm a flea on a dog. Hickok tells us you're a natural-born killer. Says it doesn't bother you a bit. Says one time, out there in Las Vegas, you went after a colored man with a bicycle chain. Whipped him to death for fun.
Tough boy! Oh, I didn't believe you. I thought it was a stunt. Tough boy. Oh, a real brass boy. Wouldn't harm the fleas on a dog, just run over the dog. So Dick was afraid of me. That's amusing. I'm very amused. What he don't know is, I almost did shoot him.
Tell us about it, Perry.
I'm thinking. I want to remember this, just the way it was. Well, it all started with a letter I got while I was out in Bull, Idaho. That was September or October. The letter was from Richard, and he said he was on to a cinch, the perfect score. He wrote me, urging me to come back to Kansas and go partners with him. He never said what kind of score it was, just that it was a surefire cinch. He said after I'd left Lansing, he settled with someone who once worked for a wealthy wheat grower out in western Kansas, Mr. Clutter. Richard drew me a diagram of the Clutter house. He knew where everything was, doors, halls, bedrooms. He said one of the ground floor rooms was used as an office, and in the office there was a safe, a wall safe. He said Mr. Clutter needed it because he always kept on hand large sums of cash, never less than $10,000. The plan was to rob the safe, and if we were seen, well, whoever saw us would have to go. Richard must have said it 1,000,000 times. No witnesses.
How many of these witnesses did he think there might be? I mean, how many people did he expect to find in the Clutter house?
That's what I wanted to know, but he wasn't sure. At least 4, probably 6. And it was possible the family might have guests. He thought we ought to be ready to handle up to 12.
Ugh.
Me too. Seemed to me that was a little off. 12 people. But Richard said it was a cinch. He said, we're gonna go in there and splatter those walls with hair. The mood I was in, I let myself be carried along. But also, I'll be honest, I had faith in Richard. He struck me as being very practical, the masculine type. And I wanted the money as much as he did. I wanted to get it and go to Mexico. But I hoped we could do it without violence. Seemed to me we could if we wore masks. We argued about it. After waiting under a tree for a while, I told Richard to count me out. If he was determined to go ahead with it, he'd have to do it alone. He started the car, we were leaving, and I thought, bless Jesus. I've always trusted my intuitions. They've saved my life more than once. But halfway down the road, Richard stopped. He was sore as hell. I could see he was thinking, here I've set up this big score, here we've come all this way, and now this punk wants to chicken out. He said, Maybe you think I ain't got the guts to do it alone, but by God, I'll show you who's got guts. There was some liquor in the car. We each had a drink and I told him, "Okay, Richard, I'm with you." So we turned back, parked where we had been before. Richard put on gloves. I'd already put on mine. He carried the knife and a flashlight. I had the gun. The house looked tremendous in the moonlight, looked empty. I remember hoping there was nobody home.
But you saw a dog?
No.
The family had an old gun-shy dog. We couldn't understand why he didn't bark, unless he'd seen a gun and bolted.
Well, I didn't see anything or nobody. That's why I never believed it about an eyewitness.
Not eyewitness, witness. Someone whose testimony associates you and Hickok with this case. Hickok had the knife, you had the gun. How did you get into the house?
The door was unlocked. A side door. It took us into Mr. Clutter's office. Then we waited in the dark, listening. But the only sound was the wind. There was quite a little wind outside. It made the trees move and you could hear the leaves. We saw the desk. The safe was supposed to be in the wall directly behind the desk, but we couldn't find it. It was a paneled wall, and there were books and framed maps, and I noticed on a shelf a terrific pair of binoculars. Well, when we couldn't find the safe, Richard doused the flashlight and we moved in darkness out of the office and across a parlor, a living room. We came to a hall and a door, and Richard, remembering the diagram, said it was a bedroom. He shined the flashlight and opened the door. A man said, "Honey?" He'd been asleep, and he blinked and said, "Is that you, honey?" Richard asked him, "Are you Mr. Clutter?" He was wide awake now. He sat up and said, "Who is it? What do you want?" Richard told him, very polite, like we were a couple of door-to-door salesmen. "We want to talk to you, sir. In your office, please." And Mr. Clutter, barefoot, just wearing pajamas, he went with us to the office and we turned off the office lights. Richard said, "Now, sir, all we want you to do is show us where you keep that safe." But Mr. Clutter says, "What safe?" He says he don't have any safe. I knew right then it was true. He had that kind of face. You just knew whatever he told you was pretty much the truth. But Richard shouted at him, "Don't lie to me, you son of a bitch! I know goddamn well you got a safe." My feeling was nobody had ever spoken to Mr. Clutter like that, but he looked Richard straight in the eye and told him, being very mild about it, said, well, he was sorry, but he just didn't have any safe. Richard tapped him on the chest with a knife and says, "Show us where that safe is, or you're going to be a good bit sorrier." But Mr. Clutter, you see, he was scared, but his voice stayed mild and steady. He went on denying he had a safe. Some time along in there, I fixed the telephone, the one in the office. I ripped out the wires. And I asked Mr. Clutter if there were any other telephones in the house. He said yes, there was one in the kitchen, so I took the flashlight and went to the kitchen. It was quite a distance from the office. When I found the telephone, I removed the receiver and cut the line with a pair of pliers. Then heading back, I heard a noise, a creaking overhead. I stopped at the foot of the stairs leading to the second floor. It was dark and I didn't dare use the flashlight, but I could tell there was someone there. At the top of the stairs, silhouetted against a window. A figure. Then it moved away. For all I knew, maybe it was somebody with a gun, but Richard wouldn't listen to me. He was so busy playing tough guy, bossing Mr. Clutter around. Now we'd brought him back to the bedroom. He was counting the money in Mr. Clutter's billfold. There was about $30. He threw the billfold on the bed and told him, "You've got more money in this house than that, a rich man like you, living on a spread like this." Mr. Clutter said that was all the cash he had and explained he always did business by check. He offered to write us a check. Richard just blew up. "What kind of Mongolians do you think we are?" And I thought Richard was ready to smash him. So I said, "Richard, listen to me. There's somebody awake upstairs." Mr. Clutter told us the only people upstairs were his wife and a son and a daughter. Richard wanted to know if the wife had any money, and Mr. Clutter said if she did, it would be very little, a few dollars, and he asked us, really kind of broke down, please not to bother her, because she was an invalid. She'd been ill for a long time. But Richard insisted on going upstairs. He made Mr. Clutter lead the way. At the foot of the stairs, Mr. Clutter switched on lights that lighted the hall above, and as we were going up, he said, "I don't know why you boys want to do this. I never done you any harm. I never saw you before." That's when Richard told him, "Shut up! When we want you to talk, we'll tell you." Wasn't anybody in the upstairs hall, and all the doors were shut. Mr. Clutter pointed out the rooms where the boy and girl were supposed to be sleeping, then opened his wife's door. He lighted a lamp beside the bed and told her, "It's all right, sweetheart. Don't be afraid. These men, they just want some money." She was a thin, frail sort of woman in a long white nightgown. The minute she opened her eyes, she started to cry. I told Richard, these people are telling the truth. The one who lied is your friend Floyd Wells. There isn't any safe, so let's get the hell out of here. But Richard was too ashamed to face it. He said he wouldn't believe it till we searched the whole house. He said the thing to do was tie them all up, then take our time looking around. You couldn't argue with him. He was so excited. The glory of having everybody at his mercy. That's what excited him. The idea was to lock the parents in the bathroom and wake the kids and put them there. Then bring them out one by one and tie them up in different parts of the house. And then, says Richard, after we've found the safe, we'll cut their throats. Can't shoot them, he says. That would make too much noise. Mrs. Clutter was crying and telling us, please don't hurt anybody. Please don't hurt my children. And her husband had his arms around her. We went to the boys' room. He was awake. Lying there, he was too scared to move. Richard told him to get up, but he didn't move or move fast enough, so Richard punched him, pulled him out of bed, and I said, you don't have to hit him, Richard. And I told the boy. He was only wearing a t-shirt to put on his pants. He put on a pair of blue jeans, and we locked him in the bathroom when the girl appeared, came out of her room. She was all dressed like she'd been awake some while. I mean, she had socks and slippers and a kimono, and her hair was wrapped in a bandana. She was trying to smile. She said, good grief, what is this, some kind of joke? I don't guess she thought it was much of a joke, though, not after Richard opened the bathroom door and shoved her in. Richard stood guard outside the bathroom while I reconnoitered. I frisked the girl's room and found a little purse, like a doll's purse. Inside it was a silver dollar. I dropped it somehow, and it rolled across the floor, rolled under a chair. I had to get down on my knees. And just then, it was like I was outside myself, watching myself in some nutty movie. It made me sick. I was disgusted. Richard and all his talk about a rich man's safe, and here I am, crawling on my belly to steal a child's silver dollar. $1, and I'm crawling on my belly to get it. But that's what you do. You get what you can. I frisked the boys' room too. Not a dime. It was like I wasn't part of it, more as though I was reading a story, and I had to know what was going to happen. The end. So I went back upstairs. And now let's see. That's when we tied them up. Mr. Clutter first. We called him out of the bathroom, and I tied his hands together. Then I marched him all the way down to the basement.
Alone and unarmed?
I had the knife.
But Hickok stayed guard upstairs?
To keep them quiet. Anyway, I didn't need help. I worked with rope all my life.
Were you using the flashlight, or did you turn on the basement lights?
The lights. The basement was divided into 2 sections. One part seemed a playroom. Took him to the other section, the furnace room. I saw a big cardboard box leaning against the wall. A mattress box. Well, I didn't feel I ought to ask him to stretch out on the cold floor, so I dragged the mattress box over, flattened it, and told him to lie down. I tied his feet, then tied his hands to his feet. I asked him if it was too tight, and he said no, but said would we please leave his wife alone. There was no need to tie her up. She wasn't going to holler or try to run out of the house. He said she'd been sick for years and years, and she was just beginning to get a little better. Next thing, I brought the boy down. First I put him in the room with his dad, tied his hands to an overhead steam pipe. Then I figured that wasn't very safe. He might somehow get loose and undo the old man, or vice versa. So I cut him down and took him to the playroom, where there was a comfortable-looking couch. I roped his feet to the foot of the couch, roped his hands, then carried the rope up, and made a loop around his neck, so if he struggled, he'd choke himself. Once, while I was working, I put the knife down on this. Well, it was a freshly varnished cedar chest. The whole cellar smelled of varnish, and he asked me not to put my knife there. The chest was a wedding present he'd built for somebody. A sister, I believe he said. Just as I was leaving, he had a coughing fit, so I stuffed a pillow under his head. Then I turned off the lights.
But you hadn't taped their mouths?
No, the taping came after. After I'd tied both the women in their bedrooms. Mrs. Clutter was still crying. At the same time, she was asking about Richard. She didn't trust him, but said she felt I was a decent young man. I'm sure you are, she says, and made me promise I wouldn't let Richard hurt anybody. I think what she really had in mind was her daughter. I was worried about that myself. I suspected Richard was plotting something I wouldn't stand for. When I finished tying Mrs. Clutter, sure enough, I found he'd taken the girl to her bedroom. She was in the bed, and he was sitting on the edge of it, talking to her. I stopped that. I told him to look for the safe while I tied her up. After he'd gone, I roped her feet together and tied her hands behind her back. Then I pulled up the covers, tucked her in till just her head showed. I began a conversation with her. All the time we were talking, we could hear the lunatic roaming down below. Looking for the safe, looking behind pictures, tapping the walls, tap, 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 like some nutty woodpecker. When he came back, just to be a real bastard, I asked how he found it. When we were heading along the hall toward Nancy's room, Richard said, "I'm gonna bust that little girl," and I said, "Uh-huh, but you'll have to kill me first." He looked like he didn't believe he'd heard it right. He says, "What do you care? How you can bust her too." Now that's something I despise. Anybody that can't control themselves sexually. Christ, I hate that kind of stuff. I told him straight, "Leave her alone, else you've got a buzzsaw to fight." That really burned him, but he realized it wasn't the time to have a flat-out free-for-all. So he says, "Okay, honey, if that's the way you feel." The end of it was we never even taped her. We switched off the hall light and went down to the basement. I'll bet he never said anything about wanting to rape the girl. When we went down to Mr. Clutter, he asked me, and these were his last words, how his wife was, if she was all right. And I said she was fine. She was ready to go to sleep. And I told him it wasn't long till morning, and how in the morning somebody would find them. And then all of it, me and Richard and all, would seem like something they dreamed. I wasn't kidding him. I didn't want to harm the man. I thought he was a very nice gentleman, soft-spoken. I thought right up to the moment I cut his throat. Wait, I'm not telling it the way it was. After we taped them, Richard and I went off in a corner to talk it over. Remember now, there were hard feelings between us. Just then, it made my stomach turn to think I'd ever admired him, lapped up all that brag. I asked him for the knife, and he gave it to me, and I said, "All right, Richard, here goes." But I didn't mean it. I meant to call his bluff, make him argue me out of it, make him admit he was a phony and a coward. See, it was something between me and Richard. I knelt down beside Mr. Clutter, and the pain of kneeling. I thought of that goddamn dollar, silver dollar, the shame, disgust. And they told me never to come back to Kansas. But I didn't realize what I'd done till I heard the sound, like somebody drowning, screaming underwater. I handed the knife to Richard. I said, "Finish him. You'll feel better." Richard tried, or pretended to, but the man had the strength of 10 men. He was half out of his ropes. His hands were free. Richard panicked. Richard wanted to get the hell out of there, but I wouldn't let him go. The man would have died anyway. I know that, but I couldn't leave him like he was. I told Richard to hold the flashlight, focus it, then I aimed the gun. The room just exploded, went blue. Right there, in those few seconds before we ran out to the car and drove away, that's when I decided I better shoot Richard. He said over and over, he drummed it into me, "No witnesses," and I thought, he's a witness. I don't know what stopped me. God knows I should have done it. Shot him dead. Got in the car and kept on going till I lost myself in Mexico.
Dr. Jones identified himself to the court as a physician, specializing in the field of psychiatry. The question was, based upon your examination, do you have any opinion as to whether or not Richard Eugene Hickok knew right from wrong at the time of the commission of the crime? He was forced to answer, yes. However, if he had been allowed to speak further, he would have testified. In summary, he shows fairly typical characteristics of what would be psychiatrically labeled as a severe character disorder. It is important that steps be taken to rule out the possibility of organic brain damage, since at present it might have substantially influenced his behavior during the past several years. When asked the same question in regards to Perry Smith, Dr. Jones answered that he did not have an opinion. But had he been permitted to discourse on the cause of his indecision, he would have testified, "Perry Smith shows definite signs of severe mental illness. His childhood, related to me and verified by portions of the prison records, was marked by brutality and lack of concern on the part of both parents. He seems to have grown up without direction, without love, and without ever having absorbed any fixed sense of moral values. He is oriented, hyper-alert to things going on about him, and shows no sign of confusion. He is above average in intelligence and has a good range of information considering his poor educational background. Two features in his personality make up..." Let's start again for that part. No, you don't have to cut off. Okay. Two features in his personality makeup stand out as particularly pathological. The first is his paranoid orientation toward the world.
He is suspicious and distrustful of others, tends to feel that others discriminate against him, and feels that others are unfair to him and do not understand him. He is overly sensitive to criticisms that others make of him, and cannot tolerate being made fun of. He is quick to sense slight or insult in things others say, and frequently may misinterpret well-meant communications. He feels he has great need of friendship and understanding, but he is reluctant to confide in others, and when he does, expects to be misunderstood or even betrayed. He not infrequently groups all people together as being hypocritical, hostile, and deserving of whatever he is able to do to them. Akin to this first trait is the second, an ever-present, poorly controlled rage, easily triggered by any feeling of being tricked, slighted, or labeled inferior by others. For the most part, his rages in the past have been directed at authority figures, father, brother, army sergeant, state parole officer, and have led to violent assaultive behavior on several occasions. Both he and his acquaintances have been aware of these rages, which he says mount up in him, and of the poor control he has over them. When turned toward himself, his anger has precipitated ideas of suicide. The inappropriate force of his anger and lack of ability to control or channel it reflect a primary weakness of personality structure. In addition to these traits, the subject shows mild early signs of a disorder of his thought processes. He has poor ability to organize his thinking. He seems unable to scan or summarize his thought, becoming involved and sometimes lost in detail, and some of his thinking reflects a magical quality, a disregard of reality. The jury has come to a unanimous decision. Perry Smith and Richard Hickok are deemed guilty and sentenced to death.
I just want to say, I hold no hard feelings. You people are sending me to a better world than this ever was. Nice to see you. I think it's a hell of a thing to take a life in this manner. I don't believe in capital punishment, morally or legally. Maybe I had something to contribute, something. It would be meaningless to apologize for what I did, even inappropriate, but I do. I apologize.